Good day and welcome to the Roman Riccio Show. Today I'm going to be sitting here with my dad, Pat Riccio, and he's going to be talking to us about his illustrious music and film career. Welcome to the show, Dad.
Thank you.
So, what was it like growing up with such a powerful father figure?
Yeah, my old man was very powerful. I mean, he could, just a stare was enough to stop you dead in your tracks. And even the kids on the street, the old man Riccio came home, like, we got to be cool. He's none of this jumping over the fence and all that kind of stuff. But he was a tremendous influence, from a musical standpoint and from a leadership standpoint as well, because, he was a band leader and had his own orchestra and had his own small group.
So, what was the name of your first band and who was in it?
Oh, God. The first band was called The Tall Cool Ones, and that was myself, Prakash John on cello, and Tim Baker on bongos. And I think we knew 3 songs. One of them was Moanin' by the Jazz Messengers, written by Bobby Timmons, piano player. And another one was Wipeout by the Safaris. It was kind of like a surfing song that we translated to our small group.
Okay, so why and when did you move to Halifax?
My dad called me, I was in school. I got you got a phone call, go down, so I went down to the phones. And my dad said, look, your marks, they're no good, right? And I said, well, yeah, they're pretty bad. He goes, look, here's the deal. There's an opening for a piano player on a television show called Music Hop, which is, a weekly show. And it's out of Halifax, which means that you'd have to leave this Thursday. This was on a Tuesday, okay? And I had to go around to all the teachers, and it was a pink piece of paper, I remember that. And I had to get them all to sign it. And I remember Mrs. Torrens, my French teacher, was ecstatic that I was leaving. She several times told me that, you see that gas station across the road there? You should be working there, because I was so bad at French. And her breath, oh my goodness. First, I had to go in early every morning, to go to French class, and she'd be talking to me, and oh man, bad breath. Wow. But yeah, that's why. It was a television show in Halifax, and I left on the Thursday, and it was very, very exciting, very, very intimidating, because I'd never been away from the house, ever, and all of a sudden I'm on an airplane going 2,000 miles away, and Brian Ahern, who was the musical director of the show, met me at the airport, and in his vet, he had I think it was a 64 Stingray, 427. It was like a monster, okay? And the weird thing was he had snow tires on the back because he kept driving back and forth to Toronto in the vet.
When and why did you lose your job at Arc Sound?
Oh, yeah. Fired again, yeah. When I got back from Halifax, from the television show, I really didn't have anything, going on. And so I think I worked at a gas station for a while. But I wanted to do something in music. And my dad said, well, look, I know this guy named Bill Gilliland. He's the vice president of a record company called Arc Sound, and I want you to call him every Friday and ask him if anything is open. Are there any openings, you know? Which I did. For months I did this. And if I didn't make that phone call, my life was hell. So I made that phone call. Finally, Bill Gilliland says, okay, come on down, come on, we'll find something for you to do. And what they found for me to do was sweep the studio floor with a broom. I mean, the real deal, right? And you know what musicians are like, so there was lots of stuff to sweep up. And then one night, he asked me to come into the control room. And they were mixing a song. And Tony DiMaria, who was another producer there at ARC, was handling the mix. And Gilliland says to me, what would you do with this? And I said, well, you know what? I don't hear enough horns. I'd bring out the horns. And he goes, yeah. And they brought out the horns, and it sounded good. So he took me out to dinner at some hamburger joint, and he said, look, I'm going to make you a producer. You've got great ears, and you've got great instincts, and you're the right age. I was 18. And he said, but we got to do something about your look. You don't look old enough. So he took me to this hairdresser. I'm getting to the end of this where I get fired. He takes me to this hairdresser, and they give me stick-on, like, what did Elvis call them? Muffin, or...
Mutton chops?
Mutton chops, sideburns, thank you, mutton chops. And they look pretty good, they look pretty real, you know, so I wore those, and this is how I, you know, broke into the production end. And then I teamed up with a guy named Richard Gilliland, Bill's brother, and we wrote, oh man, we wrote tons and tons of songs. We worked with a few different artists, and one of them was Terry Black. We did an album with Terry Black called An Eye for an Ear. And that received some notoriety. In fact, you can still hear it on the internet. You can still get it on YouTube. A couple of the songs are still up there. It was kind of a revolution type theme throughout the album, because that's what the thing was in those days, the war in Vietnam, and you know, peace and brother and all this kind of stuff. And we did that, and then he asked me to produce Johnny Loveson, who was a guitar player in Toronto, tremendous player. Johnny's still playing, he's just great. But he was like 16 or 17 then. And we took the guys to New York, and we actually recorded in the same studio that Jimi Hendrix recorded in. This was a big thrill from us, same engineer too. And three-piece band, you know, drums, bass, guitar. And in mixing it, somehow I buried the vocal. The vocal was supposed to be right in the middle of the track and right there, but it was just under maybe 5 dB what it should have been, and you couldn't really hear what he was saying. And we brought it back, and this is after Gilliland must have spent 10 grand. In those days, that was huge money. And it was a bust. And there was no fixing it because, you know, you can't go back, you know, it was just, so that eventually led to the fact that he called us into his office one day and he said, look, you guys have run up like an $80,000 studio budget this year, and we got nothing to show for it. So I'm sorry, that's it, the end of the road.
So then how did you get the gig with Anne Marie?
Well, during that time that I was producing at Arc Sound, Anne Murray was just sort of starting to happen. It's before Snowbird. And her keyboard player, a guy named Bill Spear, great player, really nice player, was her main keyboard player, and I was the utility keyboard player. I'd play like secondary parts, piano parts, or very few electronic pianos there. In those days, they had, I forget the name of the keyboard he had, but also organ. And so right from 1968, I was working with Anne on records. And then live dates and television shows. We did quite a few CBC specials that I was the, again, utility keyboard player. And then in 1972, this is very early in 72, maybe March, something like that, Skip Beckwith, who was her bass player, band leader, called me and said, listen, Billy's sick. He came back from Europe and he's in the hospital. Would you like to play with Ann on a steady basis? And I said, well, I guess. He goes, well, what are you doing for the next couple of years? I said, nothing. So that was on, this is another Rush deal. That was on like a Tuesday, and we were leaving for Chicago on Friday, and I had to learn the entire show. And so I locked myself in the basement, and I practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. I mean, like 24/7 practically. And when I made that rehearsal, it was on a Thursday, I think. Ann was like, whoa, this guy really knows the show. Like, it's not like he sort of knows it, you know. And that was it. I was in.
So what was it like working with the first version of the Anne Murray Band?
It was a lot of fun. I know that. It was a huge party, like all the time. Andy Cree on drums, D.T. Thompson on sax, and Skip on bass, and myself on keys, and Miles Wilkinson, who is now a producer. He's got a mobile studio out of Nashville. I think he calls it Troubadour Studios or something like that. But Miles was the guitar player and the sound guy. So Miles, you know, talk about wearing too many hats. Oh my goodness. And there were lots of like stories about what happened because he had so many things going on. But those years were pretty terrifying for Ann because it was like she had a pack of wild hyenas behind her. Competent musicians for sure, but the extracurricular activity was, you know, I'm talking drugs and booze, was pretty prevalent. And me being new, like I'm kind of like, oh, whoa, this is what the big time is like. I'm in, you know. And, you know, we got into a lot of trouble, you know, because, you know, well, not serious trouble, not like police trouble, but like things would happen. Like DT fell off the stage one night and, you know, Miles fell down the stairs at the cave in Vancouver.
When did Lenny Breau come into the picture?
That was shortly after I joined the band. I think it was somewhere in probably about a year after I joined, or maybe even less than that, I don't know. We were doing a Western Canada tour. No, we were going to end up in Western Canada. Yeah, we started in Chicago, I believe. Anyway, that's, you know, somewhere before that, a couple of weeks before that, Lenny wasn't really doing much. He was kicking around Toronto, and Skip, I think he was even staying at Skip's house. Skip said, you know, hey, Lenny, why don't you come on the road with us? You know, we'll pay you a few $100 a week, and, you know, maybe you can come home with some money and blah, blah, blah. And of course he said, yeah. And, you know, it sort of worked. Lenny, of course, is probably, arguably, one of the greatest guitar players that ever picked up the instrument. He could do things on the guitar that other guys couldn't even begin to approach, or, you know, he just was that kind of player. He practiced in his younger days 8 hours a day, no lie, just hours and hours and hours of practicing. You know, this story is everywhere, but he had a funny little crook in his baby finger from, you know, playing like major 7 chords on the guitar are very difficult because the 2 strings are a 5th apart, or a 4th apart. Is it 5th? You know, it's a 4th apart, and so it's difficult to get that major 7 sound. But Lenny had practiced it so often that the finger was permanently crooked. You know, there was a lot of gigs where I know this is insane, but we did a gig in Boston, and I can't remember the sax. It was a jazz sax player. I'm embarrassed. Was our opening act, and the audience was all black, no white faces. And we come on stage, and when Lenny played, they would spontaneously applaud. Like if he played a little solo, they would just, you know, and they get like, and who, you know. It was, but yeah, we played a few of those weird gigs. But then, you know, Lenny, I don't want to disgrace his memory because of the tremendous musical influence he had on the entire guitar playing world. I mean, Chet Atkins, Jerry Reed, they would be following us around just so they could talk to Lenny, or just sit in the dressing room and watch him play and pick up some stuff, you know. He was that kind of player. But there were a few incidents where, you know, things happened that, you know, like one night he fell into a plate of spaghetti at somebody's house in Dallas, Texas, and then he laid out in the sun in Atlanta, Georgia, to the point where he got like third-degree burns. He was just so high and so happy about the sun that, you know, and but all in all, I revere those days because I often was the guy that took care of Lenny, because he did need taking care of. It was like, you know, he could play things that no one else could play, but he couldn't walk across the street, you know, that kind of thing. And I would be with him as often as I could, and 24/7, making sure he got to his room, making sure he was okay. And that was a matter of honor for me. Wow. But, and then when we got back, you know, it was obvious that it wasn't working. We got home, and he was only with us, I think, for about 6 months. And then, you know, a lot of things were changing around those years. The first version band was getting to the point where Ann was fed up, and I was chosen by her and Skip to become the new band leader. So one of my first order of businesses was to fire everybody, which I did. I did a lot of that. I got fired a lot, and I did a lot of firing. Good. This was my lot in life.
So why do you think that Capitol Records delayed the release of There's a Hippo in My Tub?
Because they thought we were out of our minds. They thought, here's my take on this. I think they were having negotiating problems with Capitol, okay? And
they meaning?
Balmer, yeah. Like Ann's company. And there was something about they had to complete another album before they'd get the next advance, or one of those kind of, you know, gray areas. And Lyman McGinnis, who was Ann's business manager at that time, came up with the idea of, like, let's do a novelty album. They want an album? We'll give them an album. Let's do a novelty album. And amongst them, they came up with the idea for a children's album. And Ann approached me and said, would you produce it? And I said, sure. And then, of course, it turned out to be an absolute gem. It's a really classic piece of work. But when we went down to Capitol Tower in LA at Hollywood and Vine, you know, the big white building, the round building, we're upstairs, you know, and I got my feet up and I'm drinking a Heineken, like I think I'm taking over the world here. And I forget who it wasn't Arnold Gosowich, I forget who the president was, but he turns to me and he says, so what is wrong with you? Why are you trying to ruin Anne Murray's career? And I'm like, you know, this is a novelty album. This is not something that an international star releases. We don't do that kind of thing. I just don't understand your logic. And I'm because it wasn't my idea. I, of course, produced it. But in their eyes, I'm the producer. I'm the guy that they got to, you know, reprimand. Anyway, we walked out of there with our heads low and our egos deflated, and I think it was close to a year. It might not have been that long, but Capitol Canada decided to release the album. And within, I'm talking weeks, it was gold, and within a few weeks after that, it was platinum. It sold like proverbial hotcakes. And then Sesame Street Records picked it up in the United States, and again, another bunch of sales. It's sold in the millions over the years. Mm-hmm. And shortly after that, Kenny Loggins has got a children's album, Dolly Parton's got a children's album, Juice Newton's got a like everybody followed up. And that album won a Juno Award at the Junos in that year. I think it was 1977 or 78 or something like that.
So what's the story of like during, I guess it was in the 80s when you switched from using the orchestra to the synthesizer version of the show? How did that go down?
Well, it was basically Paul de Villiers, who was he was a sound engineer from South Africa in those days. The de Villiers family is very famous in South Africa. They're in politics. They're politicians. But Paul had his finger on the pulse of what was happening. And we were very close, Paul and I. I believed in him and he believed in me. I was the one who found Paul and hired him. Well, I didn't find him. Tex found him. And I went to see him and I hired him. And this was in the middle of a bunch of other controversy involved with the show regarding the sound. We weren't particularly happy what was happening. So Paul came on board. And Paul also worked with Stevie Wonder and Bette Midler and Neil Diamond. He worked with everybody. And he came to me one day and said, "Look, Pat, what's coming out of Los Angeles is self-contained units. And I think you should maybe think about that." And I said, "Okay. You mean like replace the orchestra with a synthesizer?" And he's like, "Yeah." I said, "Well, who would do that? Do you know anybody?" He goes, "Yeah, I know this kid named Steve Sexton, who is currently working with Red Ryder, but you might be able to pull him away if you offer him the Anne Murray show." And yeah, I met with Steve, and yeah, I liked him a lot. And so I approached Leonard, Anne's manager, and said, "Look, here's what's happening in the business. Out of LA, everybody's coming out self-contained. They're not using orchestras, they're using synthesizers to create the same sounds or similar sounds." And he's like, "Are you nuts? What, you lost your mind? You can't do that. A synthesizer?" He didn't really understand what I meant. I know that in all fairness. Great guy, Leonard. So we go to Roy Thompson Hall, and he says to me, "Okay, we're going to A-B. We're going to have the orchestra, and we're going to have the synthesizer. And I'm going to be at the board, and I'm going to go synthesizer, orchestra, synthesizer, orchestra." And of course, he did that, and you couldn't tell the difference. At least he couldn't tell the difference. So, bada bing, Sexton's hired. We immediately go to Yamaha and purchase a GS20 synthesizer, 4 tone generators, $20,000. I couldn't believe it. They wrote the check, like they couldn't write it fast enough. And so there we are on stage with the GS20. I think Sexton had an emulator with him as well, but the sounds were absolutely amazing, gorgeous. And that year, we became one of the top 5 grossing acts in North America, even though we were Canadian. We were Stevie Wonder, Bette Midler, Whitney Houston, Neil Diamond, Anne Murray. And we had a big write-up in Billboard. Those were very heady years, very heady times. But I got to say again, I thank Paul de Villiers. He, for some of you out there in listener land, might know Mr. Mister. Paul de Villiers produced Mr. Mister. He also worked with Yes. He also produced some of their material. I wish I knew where he was. I think he's somewhere in Colorado on a mountain or something. I don't know. But Paul was and is a very, very talented producer and engineer.
So what was it like playing the first version of the Kurzweil keyboard on tour?
Whoa, yeah, there was, you know, acoustic piano players for all those years were, you know, had to go with whatever keyboard was there. And I mean, even if it's a grand piano, there's tuning involved, and there's all these things that have to be taken into consideration. The stage, where you're going to put it, and, you know, it's huge. So I don't know if it may have even been Paul de Villiers that said, you know, there's this guy in Boston, in Massachusetts, no, Maryland, that is coming out with this electronic keyboard. And it's 88 and it's weighted. And you should check it out. So, of course, in those days, I go to Leonard and I say, Leonard, I need like $600. I'm going to Maryland with Steve Sexton. We're going to check out this keyboard. Yeah, here's the money, you know, whatever. So we go down there and I check it out and I'm like, whoa, man, this is pretty cool. And I said, what do you think, Steve? He goes, I don't know, Pat, it's your decision. You know, he wasn't really sold on it. And of course, then when we get it out on the road, they sent a technician with us. He was with us 24/7 because it would break down. It would stop in the middle of a tune. There were a lot of glitches that they hadn't worked out yet. And the other guy that took out that Kurzweil keyboard, Stevie Wonder. The only two guys, me and him. And then, of course, they started, you know, a lot of guys got into them. And I remember there was I was the music background musician booker at Wonderland for a couple of years back in those days, back in the 80s. And George Benson came into town. And of course, his keyboard player, Barnaby Finch, was playing a Kurzweil. And he couldn't figure out how to get certain things. And so I, you know, went out into sound check and I said, oh, well, do this, like I act like a big shot, right? Boom, 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 boom. And he's like, oh, man. And he starts, he was an amazing, wicked player, Barnaby. And the other keyboard player, I can't remember his name, but he was also wicked. But he was playing a DX7. And he gave me at least 3 or 4 of his custom sounds that he had on strips, how to program them in. And so I was using those sounds on stage and like really cool, you know. Wow. And of course, Barnaby was so thankful, and so was George. He invited me into his dressing room and, you know, that kind of stuff because he was so pleased that Barnaby was happy with this instrument that nobody could figure out, you know. The only reason I figured it out is because I had the technician with me 24/7 for like, I don't know, 3 weeks or something until we got all the bugs out of it.
Why do you think you were able to last so long as the musical director for the Anne Murray Show?
Well, in retrospect, I mean, Steve Sexton's the guy that took over for me, and he's been with her since 1987. So he made it like, you know, 20 years or 20 plus. But I was lucky enough to be the guy when Anne was molten lava. She was so hot. And I always put the show and Anne before me. On many, many occasions, I hung my rear end out there with a decision, not the least of which was changing over from, you know, synthesizers from orchestra to synthesizers. If that hadn't have worked, I'd have been gone so fast you'd thought somebody ripped me off. But that worked. You know, there were other things that worked, like decisions in terms of choosing musicians and singers. I was very good at that. Again, because I had her interests and the show's interests ahead of mine. I wanted to get the absolute best. And when I took Sexton, Red Rider took a while to recover because Steve was an integral part of that band. But of course, they recovered beautifully and everything's fine. But one band that didn't recover is called the Arrows. Peter Blakeney and Gary Craig were the drummer and bass player for the Arrows, who were produced by, oh my goodness, my name's, maybe I'll think of it. Anyway, I took them from the Arrows and hired them to do the Anne Murray Show. And this producer that I can't think of his name of, he's a keyboard player, tremendous player, called me up and said, man, what are you doing, man? Like, how can you do this to me? I just put this band together. We got an album coming out. I mean, what are you doing? I said, hey, listen, this is for Anne. This isn't for me, okay? I need the best possible players that I can find in Toronto, and these are really nice guys, and that's important too. It's a done deal. And he was like, oh, well, thanks a lot, you know, boom. Oh, man, I wish I could think of his name. Tyson.
Dave Tyson?
Dave Tyson, yeah. And of course, we've never spoken since. But these kind of things kept me in my job, okay? That's what was most important, Anne and the show. And I made sure that everything I did was to keep that machine functioning like a clock. And it was. I mean, in those days in the 80s, there was no band, well, of course there were bands as tight as us, but we were really, really tight. And it showed and it sounded in the music.
Who were some of the comedians that you ended up working with?
The comedians that we worked with on the road, I mean, we worked with everybody. There was a guy on a show called Soap that had a puppet, a black puppet, and I can't remember his name. We worked with him. We also worked with Rodney Dangerfield, and Rodney was amazing. Rodney was absolutely amazing. We did 2 weeks in Vegas with him. We worked with Seinfeld for like 2 years. Jerry Seinfeld was our opening act, all down the east coast of the United States. Man, there's so many other. Lonnie Shore was our opening act for a lot of the outdoor gigs. Lonnie Shore, of course, was a Vegas comedian, never really made it to the shine of, you know, Pryor or Seinfeld or any of these, you know, Robin Williams. But Lonnie was funny, and a real nice guy. We used to go to the mall together, and, you know, he was a really nice guy. But the rest of the names elude me, Rowan. I can't remember. There were English comedians. When we were in England, there were...
Didn't you end up working with George Carlin at some point? No. That's an interesting story. Carlin was working at the same venue that we were. I think he was in another room or something. And he came backstage one night. And we were in the dressing room. We were all like drinking and, you know, running around like idiots and all that. And Gatto starts doing Carlin to Carlin, right? And I got so mad because I was embarrassed, and I'm like, what? You know, and I put Gatto in the corner with his face facing into the corner, and Carlin looks at me and goes, man, you got a really weird sense of humor, and he walks out. But I do remember one other that we worked with is Frank Gorshin, who used to be the Riddler on Batman, the original television series. Wow, what a dark guy. I mean, he had the smile and the whole thing, you know, when he was on stage, but when he was off stage, it was like there was this big, dark, bad vibe following him around everywhere. He freaked us out. None of us would really want to get too close to him because it just was too creepy. Oh my God.
Although tremendously talented, and when he was on, he was on. He was very professional, did his act, people laughed their heads off, and he did all kinds of you know, imitations of other actors and other comedians and stuff. Dark guy though. Whoa. In fact, you know, the only one that really wasn't out of his mind was Seinfeld.
So what are some examples of the TV specials that you worked on in the 70s, 80s? Oh
my goodness. Well, right from the beginning, the first television special we did, that I did with Anne, we did it in a church, and it had something to do with some Roman Catholic ritual or some special Roman Catholic occasion. We had the priests with the smoking, you know, I don't know what they're called, and deeply religious music. We worked with the Spinners. Alan Thicke was the producer on most of these specials. The Spinners, I remember, Rubber Band Man. It was a lot, because I played the piano in that. It was a nice piano part. And, oh gosh, Roman, there's so many specials. We must have done at least 10 in the early to middle 70s. And then, yeah, we did one in Jamaica, Anne Murray in Jamaica. We went down there for 6 weeks. What an experience. It was just absolutely wonderful. Working with the Jamaican choir, I forget what they were called. Oh my goodness, my memory. All dressed up in suits and beautiful dresses, and they sang, "Beneath the snowy mountain," you know, Snowbird, only as a classical piece. And, you know, we were in Negril, we were in Montego Bay, we were in Sans Souci, we went to Kingston to do some of the mixing for the television show. Then we did one in Quebec, which was the first of 2 international television specials produced by Smith Hemian out of Los Angeles. The Quebec Winter Carnival. And we had a few French artists on that show as well. And that was a lot of fun. And then we did another international television special called Sounds of London, out of London. And Miss Piggy was on that, you know, Frank Oz. And we did a celluloid duet. Now, this was at the cusp of a bunch of different technologies merging. And I don't know who came up with the idea, but here you're looking at a split television screen. On this side is either Sting or Elton John or Boy George or Modern Love.
Bowie?
David Bowie. And on this side is Anne Murray. And we're singing the same song. So what we had to do as a band was match up to the instruments and the sounds of these guys. Oh, and the Rolling Stones as well. I actually ended up singing on that track, "Make a Grown Man Cry," because we had to switch over from Jagger to Anne, and that was the transition point. And anyway, it ran about 7 minutes. And it looked great, except that it was, like I say, technology was changing. So it wasn't a necessary form of technology, because they'd already done it, that you could insert people into the video without having a split screen, you know, that kind of thing. It was something like that made it like redundant, even though it had just been done. And also Bananarama was on that show. Do you know Bananarama? Wow, man. Really, really, I remember when we were in LA, I think. No, we had to be in England. No, we were in LA, and they came to LA, yeah, from England, and they were walking out of the hotel, and me and Gatto were in the back of the limo going, "Oh my God, man, they're here." You know, like we had a shot. Yeah, sure. You know, so anyway. Lots of specials.
Of the bluebird as she sings, 6 o'clock alarm never rings, but it rings and we rise, wipe the sleep out of our eyes. The shaven razor's cold and it's stale. Cheer up, sleepy Jane. What can it mean to us? Daydream.
So how did you end up getting the part in the movie Boondock Saints?
Well, Brian Twaits, who is a bass player out of Oshawa, and I put together a couple of bands with him. We had a band called Shotgun. We had a band called Pink Cadillac. He called me up one day and said, "Listen, man, why don't you get your actor card?" And I said, "What's an actor card?" He goes, "You could be an actor. You qualify because of the fact that you've been on so many TV shows and you've sung on so many albums. You qualify without having to go through the regular process, which is something like you've got to be on 6 commercials and you have to be a lead and so many stipulations." Anyway, it was $600 and I'm in. So there you go. And the very next day after I got my card, I'm on the set of Due South, you know, the one with the Mountie and all that, Paul Gross, as a detective. And I had long hair and all that, and so I looked kind of like a detective, like a hippie kind of detective. And then I got an agent who told me I had to shave all my facial hair and cut my hair if I wanted to be in commercials in Canada, because nobody with a hairy face gets a commercial in Canada. I'm like, yeah, okay. Anyway, he calls me up one day, he says, "Look, there's a shoot on site. It's at the corner of blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. It's for a movie called Boondock Saints. And, you know, they're looking for a kind of mafia type guy, and they liked your picture, so go on down there." So I go down there, and I meet one of the actors walking in from the trailers, right? And I said, "Oh, are you an extra?" And he goes, "No, I'm an actor." I said, oh, sorry. I said, "I'm just an extra," you know. So we get on set, and we're shooting this scene where they're all talking to the boss, the capo. And, you know, they're firing things back and forth. And so he goes, "Cut." And then we go back to our original starting positions. And I said to the guys, I said, "What's the matter with you guys? You're not talking like Italians. You sound like you're from Boston." The guy goes, he says, "I am from Boston." I said, "Oh, sorry, man." But I said, "You got to speak like a machine gun. What's the matter with you? You got to talk like that. You understand?" You know, and they all go, "Yeah." And then all of a sudden, Troy Duffy, the producer, comes walking out from somewhere and says, "What's your name?" I said, "Pat Riccio." He goes, "Next time we shoot this scene, you say something." That never happens, man. First of all, I broke the cardinal rule. You never direct other actors. You never say anything about what they're doing. It's up to the director to do that. Here's me going, "What are you guys doing?" But I was right. So he comes out and says, "Next time you talk." So I said something. Of course, I got cut. But now I'm in, right? And I'm in lots of scenes. And then at the end of the shoot that day, he says, or near the end of the shoot, he goes, "Listen, go to makeup. We're going to cut your throat." I said, "What?" He goes, "Go to makeup. We're going to cut your throat." It didn't, the imagery just kind of freaked me a bit. And then I figured, as an actor, they're going to cut my throat. So, but I'm sure there was something symbolic in that.
Yes.
Like the guy that directed the actors gets his throat cut, right?
Has to die.
And it ended up to be an enormous thrill and a great experience for me doing that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show.
Roman, I really enjoyed it. I really had a great time today. I mean, who doesn't like talking about themselves? Okay. I really had a great time. Thank you.
Awesome.